They called her broken. They called her cursed. They said no man would ever want a woman who couldn't give him children, and they said it loud enough that the whole town believed it before anyone thought to ask if it was even true. So her own stepfather sold her. Signed her over to a rancher nobody in town had spoken to in 2 years, took the money, and never once looked her in the eye while he did it. Abigail Harper thought her life had ended that morning on the steps of the general store. She had no idea it was only beginning. 9 months later, the same people who wouldn't meet her eyes would be standing in the street, watching her walk back into town with a baby in her arms and the truth in her hands, a truth that would bring an entire town to its knees. Stay until the end, because what happens at that harvest festival is going to remind you that the people quickest to judge are usually the ones with the most to answer for. Dr. Silas Morton had been the only physician in Millbrook Falls for 11 years, and in 11 years, nobody had ever thought to question him. That was the trouble. He examined Abigail Harper on a gray March afternoon in 1888, at Eleanor Caldwell's insistence, in a back room of the Caldwell house that smelled of lye soap and lavender water. The examination lasted 11 minutes. His conclusion took one sentence. "I'm afraid this young woman will never bear children." He offered no explanation Abigail could understand, no second test, no kindness in the delivery. He simply closed his bag, accepted his fee from Eleanor Caldwell, and left Abigail sitting alone on the edge of a stranger's bed, 22 years old, staring at a future that had just been taken from her by a man who hadn't even asked her name twice. By supper, half the town knew. By Sunday, all of it did. Infertile. The word followed Abigail down Main Street like a shadow that had learned to walk on its own. Women who used to wave at her from their porches found reasons to look away. Children whispered behind their hands. The widow Pratt, who ran the boarding house, told anyone who'd listen that she'd always sensed something wasn't right about that girl, though she couldn't say what, exactly, only that a woman could feel these things. Abigail sat through all of it with her spine straight and her hands folded, because her mother, Martha, had taught her that a lady bears what she cannot change with dignity. It was advice that had never once been tested the way it was tested that spring. Nathan Caldwell broke their engagement on a Tuesday, standing in the Harpers' front yard with his hat in his hands and his eyes on his boots the whole time. "My mother says," he started. "I don't care what your mother says, Nathan. I'm asking what you think." He didn't answer that. He put his hat back on and walked away, and Abigail stood in the yard a long time after he'd gone, understanding for the first time that the man she'd loved for 2 years had never once been brave enough to want her without his mother's permission. Eleanor Caldwell had wanted grandchildren and a daughter-in-law who could deliver them. A word from Dr. Morton was all it took to end 2 years of courtship, because in Millbrook Falls, a doctor's word was closer to gospel than the reverend's. Walter Harper had married Abigail's mother 8 years earlier, after her first husband died of fever, and in 8 years he had never once treated Abigail like his own. She was, in Walter's private arithmetic, an expense that had stopped making sense. Unmarriageable now, by the town's reckoning, which meant no dowry prospects, no son-in-law to help work the land, nothing but another mouth at his table for the rest of his natural life. "She's a burden, Martha," Walter said one evening, not troubling to lower his voice though Abigail sat close enough in the next room to hear every word. "A grown woman who can't marry and can't work a man's job. What am I supposed to do with her? She's my daughter, Walter. She's my problem now, same as everything else under this roof." A chair scraped back. "I've had an offer. A rancher up past Kestrel Ridge. Cole Brennan. Widower, keeps to himself, but he's got money and he's asked around about her." "Asked around?" "Walter, you can't mean to." "I mean exactly what I say. He'll pay well for a wife who won't cost him in babies he'll have to feed. Man like that, alone on a ranch that size, needs a woman who can work, not one who'll be laid up carrying half the year." Walter's voice went flat and final, the way it did when a decision had already been made and the conversation was only for show. It's done, Martha. I've taken his money. She leaves Friday. Abigail heard every word from the next room, and something inside her went very quiet and very still, the way the air goes still before a storm breaks. She was not being asked. She was being sold, the way a man sells a horse he's decided he can't afford to feed anymore, and there was nobody left in Millbrook Falls who would stand between her and that wagon ride. Friday came cold and gray, fitting weather for what the town had turned into a kind of public spectacle. Word had spread that Walter Harper was sending his stepdaughter off to the rancher at Kestrel Ridge, and enough people found reason to be on Main Street that morning that Abigail felt the whole town's eyes on her as Walter loaded her single trunk into the wagon. Nathan watched from across the street and did not cross it. Eleanor Caldwell watched from her porch with an expression Abigail refused to name satisfaction, because naming it would have broken something in her she needed to keep whole for the ride ahead. Poor thing, someone murmured. Sold off like livestock, and to that Brennan fellow, no less. They say he buried his wife and son himself, out past the ridge, wouldn't let the Reverend near the grave. They say worse than that. Abigail climbed into the wagon without help from anyone, because nobody offered any, and Walter drove her the 6 miles to Kestrel Ridge without a single word passing between them. The ranch, when it came into view, was nothing like the haunted, half-wild place the rumors had built in Abigail's mind. The fences stood straight and mended. Cattle grazed in a pasture kept clean of brush. A sturdy log house sat with smoke rising steady from its chimney, and standing in front of it, waiting, was a tall man with dark hair, a weathered coat, and eyes that watched the wagon approach without a trace of the cruelty Abigail had braced herself for. Walter didn't get down. He simply handed the reins to a hired boy, took an envelope from the man waiting by the house, counted it without shame, and told Abigail to get her trunk before he turned the wagon around and left without a farewell. Abigail stood in the yard, rope still chafing faint red marks into her wrists from where Walter had tied her hands for the ride, so she wouldn't run, he'd said, though there had been nowhere on God's earth for her to run to. The rancher, Cole Brennan, she assumed, though nobody had bothered introducing them, crossed the yard slow and unhurried, the way a man moves around a spooked animal he doesn't want to startle further. He knelt and untied the rope himself, gentle enough that it barely pulled against her raw skin, and when he stood again, he took his hat off. "Miss Harper." His voice was low, rough with disuse, like a man who didn't waste words on people who hadn't earned them yet. "I'm sorry for the way you got here. That's on your stepfather and on me for not stopping the arrangement sooner than I did." He glanced toward the road where Walter's wagon was already disappearing. "You should know right now. Nobody owns you here. Not me, not anybody. If you want to leave once the pass is clear in spring, I'll see you've got a horse and enough money to get wherever you're going." Abigail stared at him, too stunned to answer right away. She had spent the whole ride bracing for cruelty, for the monster of the town's whispers, and instead found a man offering her a door out before she'd even stepped through the one in front of her. "Why would you do that?" she finally managed. "You paid for me." "I paid your stepfather to get you away from him." Something moved behind Cole's pale eyes, quick and gone. "That's a different thing than buying a wife, Miss Harper, whatever the town wants to call it." Cole Brennan had lost his wife and infant daughter to a fever 2 winters before Abigail arrived, and he carried that loss the way some men carry a limp, quiet, permanent, worked around rather than spoken of. He gave Abigail her own room, built solid work into her days rather than idle waiting, and never once in those first weeks asked anything of her that a hired hand wouldn't have been asked to give. She fed the chickens, learned to milk the 2 dairy cows, mended what needed mending, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that a day spent working her body tired left less room for the town's cruel word to echo through her mind at night. "You don't have to prove yourself to me," Cole told her one evening, watching her scrub a pot with more force than the job required. "I'm not proving anything. Every muscle in your back says otherwise." He almost smiled. The closest she'd seen him come to it. "Nobody here's counting what you're worth," Miss Harper. Not the way that town did. She set the pot down, hands finally still. Then why do you let me work at all? Because idle hands sit with idle thoughts, and I've buried enough of my own bad nights to know a person needs something to do besides think. He nodded toward the window, where snow had started drifting past in the dark. Storm's coming tonight. First real one of the season. He was right. The storm hit before midnight and didn't let go for 3 days, trapping the two of them together in the small warm house while the world outside disappeared into white. It was during those snowbound days that Abigail began to see past the town's rumors to the man underneath them. A man who read aloud from a worn book of poems when the wind got too loud to sleep through, who burned the first batch of biscuits he ever attempted and laughed at himself for it, plain and unguarded, in a way that startled her into laughing too. A man who, when Abigail woke from a nightmare on the second night, gray-faced and shaking, didn't ask what it was about, only sat with her by the fire until her breathing settled, saying nothing at all, which turned out to be exactly what she needed. My wife's name was Sarah, Cole told her on the third night, unprompted, staring into the fire. Our daughter was 2 months old. Fever took them both inside a week. I built their coffins myself because I couldn't stand the thought of anyone else's hands on them. He was quiet a moment. I didn't buy a wife off your stepfather because I wanted one, Miss Harper. I did it because I heard what he was planning, and I couldn't stand the thought of another person getting used and thrown away by folks who ought to know better. You could have just told the sheriff. Stopped him without any of this. Sheriff Donovan's an honest man, but there's no law against a father marrying off his daughter poorly, even a stepfather. Only way I could see to stop it clean was to be the one who took the offer instead of some worse man taking it. He glanced at her, something raw and honest in his face. I'm not asking you to be grateful for it. I know. Abigail found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. But I am anyway. Not every hardship that spring came from town gossip. Late in April, Cole woke Abigail before dawn, already dressed, a rifle in hand. Someone's been into the north pasture. Lost 6 head overnight, by my count. His jaw was tight. Rustlers, most likely, working the ridge line where the fences run thin. I'm coming with you. Abigail. I can ride, I can shoot better than you think, and I'm not sitting in this house wondering if you're lying hurt somewhere on your own land. She was already reaching for her boots. You taught me yourself. Might as well trust the lesson took. Cole didn't waste time arguing further. They rode out together in the gray half-light and found the fence cut clean in 2 places, tracks leading north toward the tree line. It was Abigail, sharper-eyed than Cole gave her credit for, who spotted the smoke of a hidden camp before he did, tucked into a hollow half a mile off. They didn't confront the men alone. Cole had sense enough for that, riding hard instead to fetch Sheriff Jack Donovan from town, and by the time the sun was fully up, the sheriff and 2 deputized ranch hands had the rustlers rounded up and the cattle recovered, only a little worse for the trouble. Good eye, Sheriff Donovan told Abigail afterward, tipping his hat. Most folks wouldn't have caught that smoke from that distance. Most folks didn't grow up thinking they'd have to earn their place at every table they sat at, Abigail said, and found, to her own surprise, that the old bitterness behind those words had softened into something closer to plain fact than pain. Cole watched her the whole ride home, something warm and unguarded settling over his features, and said nothing about it until they'd unsaddled the horses and stood together in the barn's quiet dark. You didn't have to do any of that, he said. The riding, the tracking. I'd have managed. I know. Abigail brushed hay from her sleeve, meeting his eyes steady. I wanted to. There's a difference between a woman who has to prove her worth and a woman who simply wants to stand beside her husband when trouble comes. I'd like to think I've finally become the second kind. Spring came late and green to Kestrel Ridge, and it brought with it a change neither Abigail nor Cole had planned for or, by then, resisted very hard. The work between them had turned into partnership somewhere over the winter without either one marking the day it happened. Abigail managed the house accounts now, better than Cole ever had by his own admission, and had taken over breeding the chickens into a small, profitable flock that sold eggs as far as the next county. Cole had taught her to ride properly, patient through every fall, and had built her a proper coop with her opinions on the design instead of his own. "You could have left in March, when the passes cleared," Cole said one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch step watching the sun drop behind Kestrel Ridge. "Passes have been clear 2 months now." "I know. You still could." "I meant what I said that first day." Abigail considered the ranch spread out below them, the mended fences, the chickens she'd raised from chicks, the man beside her who had never once, in 5 months, made her feel like anything less than an equal partner in the life they'd built together. "I don't want to leave, Cole." She said it plain, the way he'd taught her to say things that mattered. "I know what this town thinks of a marriage bought with your stepfather's greed. I know I'll never give you what a whole man deserves from a wife. But I don't want to leave you." Cole turned to face her fully, something breaking open behind his careful gray eyes. "You deserve to be loved because you're Abigail, not because of what some doctor in a town that never deserved you decided your body can or can't do. I've never once thought of what you can't give me. I think about what you already have." He reached over, slow enough she could have stopped him, and took her hand. "I love you. Not the arrangement, not the convenience of it. You." Nobody had spoken words like that to Abigail in longer than she could remember, not Nathan, not her own mother, not anyone who'd known her before Millbrook Falls decided what she was worth. She leaned into him, and this time when their lips met, there was nothing careful or uncertain in it, only two people who had both spent a long winter learning exactly how much they wanted this. They married in June, in a small ceremony at the ranch with only Sheriff Jack Donovan and his wife as witnesses, because Cole wanted the day to belong to the two of them and not to a town that had never earned the right to watch. That night, in the quiet dark of the home they'd built together, Abigail let herself be loved fully and without fear for the first time in her life, and woke the next morning to Cole's steady heartbeat under her cheek and a peace she'd stopped believing she'd ever find. By late summer, Abigail knew something Dr. Silas Morton had promised her would never happen. She was afraid to believe it at first, afraid it was only wishful thinking dressed up as symptoms, and it was Cole who finally insisted they ride 2 days to the larger town of Ashford Creek to see a physician neither of them knew, so the truth would come from someone with no reason to lie either way. Dr. Benjamin Carter was younger than Dr. Morton, careful in a way Morton had never bothered to be, and thorough in his examination in a way that made Abigail understand, for the first time, just how careless her original diagnosis had truly been. "Mrs. Brennan," he said afterward, sitting across from them both with a warmth in his voice that Abigail hadn't realized she'd been starving for, "I don't know who told you that you couldn't carry a child, but I can tell you with complete confidence that whoever it was wrong. You're a healthy young woman, and you are, without question, expecting." Abigail's hands went to her mouth. Beside her, Cole made a sound that was half laugh, half something rougher, and reached for her other hand like he needed to hold on to something solid. "How?" Abigail managed, "how could he have been so wrong? I couldn't say what led to that diagnosis without examining his methods myself, Dr. Carter said carefully, "But I will tell you this isn't the first time I've heard of a frontier physician declaring a healthy young woman barren on thin evidence, sometimes none at all. It happens more than the profession likes to admit, and it costs women dearly when it does, reputations, marriages, whole futures built on a mistake nobody ever bothered to double-check." He looked between them both. "If you know of other women who've been given a diagnosis like yours, Mrs. Brennan, I'd urge them to seek a second opinion before they accept it as final. Yours won't be the only life it's ruined, I'd wager, if the man's as careless as it sounds." Abigail thought of Emily Dawson back in Millbrook Falls, newly married and quietly devastated the last time Abigail had seen her, having received the same diagnosis from the same doctor only months after Abigail's own. The thought settled into her like a seed taking root. That her truth, once spoken aloud in the right place, might do more than clear her own name. The Millbrook Falls Harvest Festival fell in late September, the one day each year the whole town gathered in front of the church for prayers, pie contests, and more gossip than the rest of the year combined. Walter Harper stood near the church steps that afternoon, comfortable in the particular way of a man who believes his choices have been proven right by time. He'd told anyone who'd listen, more than once, that selling Abigail off had been the smart decision, the responsible one, and that a man had to think of his household's future over sentiment. Wonder what became of her, Henry Collins said to no one in particular, minding the store's pie table. Never did hear if that Brennan fellow treated her decent or not. Doesn't much matter now, does it? Walter said, helping himself to a slice before it had been properly cut. Girl made her bed. It was then that a wagon came down the road into town, moving slow and steady, and the crowd's chatter dimmed as it approached, because everyone in Millbrook Falls recognized Cole Brennan's team even from a distance, and every one of them wanted to know what business brought him back into a town he hadn't set foot in for over a year. Cole stepped down first, tall and steady, and came around to help Abigail down from the wagon bench. She stepped into the square in a clean blue dress, color back in her cheeks, carrying a baby wrapped warm against her chest, and the entire Harvest Festival went silent in a way Millbrook Falls had never gone silent for anything, not even a funeral. That's Abigail Harper, someone whispered. She's got a baby, someone else said, disbelief plain in their voice. That's not possible. Dr. Morton said. Gar. Morton was wrong, Abigail said, her voice carrying clear across the square, steady in a way it had never been able to be a year ago. Dr. Morton examined me for 11 minutes and decided my whole future without a single second opinion, without proper cause, and every one of you believed him over me without asking a single question. Walter's pie slice hung forgotten in his hand. Abigail. I'm not finished, Walter. She crossed toward him, Cole a steady presence at her shoulder, and held her daughter a little higher, close enough that anyone could see the healthy pink of the baby's cheeks. You sold me for a purse of coin because you decided I wasn't worth feeding anymore. You didn't ask if the diagnosis was even true. You didn't care. All that mattered was getting rid of a burden. Reverend Thomas Whitaker stepped down from the church steps, his face gray with the particular shame of a man realizing his own failure in real time. Abigail, we all believed the doctor's word without question. I should have counseled compassion instead of accepting gossip as gospel. That failure sits with all of us, myself included. Dr. Benjamin Carter, who had traveled with them for exactly this purpose, stepped forward with a folded paper in hand. For the record of this town, I've examined Mrs. Brennan myself and can confirm there was never any medical basis for the diagnosis she was given. I'd be glad to make my findings available to Dr. Morton, should he wish to explain his methods to this community. Dar. Silas Morton, standing near the back of the crowd, said nothing at all, his face gone the color of old ash, before turning and walking quickly toward his office, a man who understood exactly how much his silence was costing him and had no honest words left to spend against it. Nathan Caldwell pushed through the crowd then, something raw and regretful on his face. Abigail, I never stopped. He stopped himself, glancing at Cole, then at the baby in Abigail's arms, and seemed to understand there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like too little, offered far too late. I'm sorry. For all of it. I chose my mother's approval over you, and I've regretted it every day since. Eleanor Caldwell said nothing at all, her face tight with the particular fury of a woman watching her own influence crumble in public. It was Emily Dawson, standing near the edge of the crowd with her own hand pressed unconsciously to her stomach, who spoke into the silence that followed. He told me the same thing, Dr. Morton. Almost the very words he used on you, Abigail. I've been afraid to hope otherwise ever since. Her voice shook, but she didn't look away. If you were wrong to believe him, maybe I was too. Abigail crossed to her and took her free hand. Go see Dr. Carter before you accept anything as final, Emily. That's all I'm asking anyone in this town to do from now on. Ask a second question before you let one man's carelessness decide a person's whole life. Sheriff Jack Donovan, who had watched the whole exchange with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, finally spoke. I'd say this town owes Mrs. Brennan an apology a good deal longer than anything said here today. Reckon that's a debt that'll take longer than an afternoon to pay off properly. Walter Harper stood alone by the pie table. The crowd's attention shifted entirely away from him now, understanding for the first time in his calculating life that he had traded his daughter for a sum of money and lost, in the exchange, every ounce of respect Millbrook Falls had ever given him. Abigail could have stood in that square all afternoon, letting the town's shame pour over Walter and Nathan and Eleanor and the doctor who'd started it all. Some part of her, honest enough to admit it, had wanted exactly that for the whole 9 months. Instead, she found her stepfather still standing frozen by the pie table, and walked over to him one more time, her daughter quiet against her shoulder. I forgive you, Walter. She watched surprise crack through his stunned expression. Not because you deserve it. Because I don't want to carry the weight of hating you for the rest of my life, on top of everything else I've had to carry this year. But I won't be coming back to your house, and I won't be calling you family again. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting what you did, or what you're capable of doing to anyone who becomes inconvenient to you. She turned before he could answer, and found Cole waiting at the wagon, watching her with the same quiet pride he'd carried since the moment Dr. Carter confirmed their daughter's healthy heartbeat months before. Ready to go home? He asked. More than ready. Abigail let him help her up onto the bench, settling their daughter carefully between them. I only needed today to say what needed saying. Everything I actually want is back at Kestrel Ridge. The following spring, on a warm afternoon with the fences freshly mended and the chickens fat and content in the coop Cole had built with Abigail's own hands guiding half the design, their daughter took her first unsteady steps across the ranch yard, wobbling straight from her father's outstretched hands into her mother's waiting arms while both of them laughed loud enough to startle the cattle in the near pasture. Word had reached them, weeks earlier, that Dr. Silas Morton had left Millbrook Falls for good, his practice too damaged by the scandal to recover, and that 3 other women besides Emily Dawson had sought second opinions from Dr. Carter since the Harvest Festival, 2 of whom had received very different, very correct diagnoses than the ones they'd been living under for years. Emily herself had written once, a short, joyful letter announcing her own good news, thanking Abigail for the courage to ask a question the whole town had been too afraid to ask. Walter Harper's standing in Millbrook Falls never fully recovered. Money, it turned out, could buy a great many things, but it had never once been able to buy back a town's respect, not once that respect had been so thoroughly and publicly lost. Abigail Brennan thought of Millbrook Falls rarely now, and when she did, it was without the old bitterness that had once followed her like a shadow down Main Street. She thought instead of the lesson she'd learned the hard way and had carried home with her, the one she hoped every woman who ever heard her story might carry too. That one man's careless word is never the whole truth of a person, that a second opinion is worth the asking, and that the people who decide your worth for you are very often wrong, and never worth believing over your own steady heart. She had arrived at Kestrel Ridge with rope marks on her wrists and a stolen future behind her. She stood in that same yard a year later with a husband who had never once doubted her worth, a daughter thriving in her arms, and a truth strong enough to bring an entire town to its knees. If Abigail's story moved you, stay close, because there's more of this family's life still to tell. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story has traveled.